Ian Brennan's an interesting guy. He started in the music business as a musician himself. Then he went on to record a bunch of these bands. He's won multiple Grammy Awards. And I talked to him a few weeks ago. He's one of these people that optimizes for, I guess you could call it the life resume. And the biggest takeaway I've had from this conversation is if you have a goal, pursue that goal until it's done. He wanted to record the band that eventually won him a Grammy for 2 years, I think he said on this podcast, 2 years, and he chased them down. They didn't want him to record them. And he had to convince them and talk them through it and all of this. And by the time that it happened, he and the band both had a Grammy. And it's a little counterintuitive because I've heard the exact opposite from people as well. People say, if you're trying to push super hard and the world is pushing back, don't do that thing. Go with the thing that's easier for you to do. And Ian has the exact opposite approach. He thinks if you have a goal and you really want to complete it, keep pushing until you succeed. Here is the interview in full with Ian Brennan on the Alex Berman podcast. Check it out. Welcome to another episode of the podcast. Today we're talking to Ian Brennan. He's a Grammy-winning producer who's produced 3 other Grammy-nominated albums and published 4 books, while also teaching violence prevention around the world since 1993 for such prestigious organizations as the Smithsonian, New York's New School, Berklee College of Music, the University of London, UC Berkeley, and the National Accademia of Science, and the National Accademia of Science in Rome. He's written about music for Guitar Player, Talkhouse, Huck, Songlines magazine, Flood magazine, Afropop Worldwide, Zero, Sound on Sound, and Tape Op. His work has been featured on the front page of the New York Times and in an Emmy-winning segment of 60 Minutes with Anderson Cooper reporting. Welcome to the podcast, Ian.
Thank you. It's nice to talk with you.
So I wanted to ask about your approach to career and like your approach to life, because it seems like you're doing a lot of stuff that wouldn't necessarily be career minded, right? You're doing a lot of fun stuff is kind of what I want to say.
Yeah, I mean, I've been, or at this point, I'm fortunate. It's taken a long time, and I don't know that it's necessarily sustainable, but I have found that if you do things that you love, they tend to work out better than doing things that seem intellectually like the right thing to do. And that's easier said than done. Obviously, you have to be practical as well. But one thing tends to feed another, and I think it's important to be mindful that that energy is not being spent in ways that are at cross purposes with your ultimate goals and values. And I think that it's easy to kind of get sidetracked oftentimes.
That's interesting. So what is your, how do you approach life? Or like, what would you say is your goal? Or like, how do you do that definition of goals and values?
Well, I think humility is underrated. I think a lot of things that are valuable and powerful nonetheless are underrated oftentimes in our society, humility being one of them and restraint being another. I think somewhat paradoxically, these things tend to sometimes help lead to success, and that can be a very abstract idea, but I think it's about balance, about the willingness to to take a stand and to pursue things doggedly and tenaciously when necessary, but also the logic to surrender when something's just not a good fit.
What did that process look like? So you went to, you've been all around the world recording music, but the one you won a Grammy for was that Libya?
It was in Algeria. It was with Tenerouan. They're actually from Mali, but their region is throughout North Africa, and we recorded in Algeria because this was pre-Arab Spring, before the war broke out, and it was the area that they felt was a little more stable and safer. It didn't last only a few months beyond when we recorded, when things really, really changed in that area.
So how did that come together? Like where were you when you decided that you wanted to do this? Or like what was in play? Like what kind of happened?
Well, I mean, it wasn't so much a decision. It was just that, when I realized that my solo career as a recording artist was not really going the way that I'd anticipated, I decided to do the other things I wanted to do that I thought that success would lead to, which was more charitable work, on the one hand, and also to begin recording other people. And so I began recording in a laundromat in San Francisco every Monday with artists, whether I liked their music or not. I felt it was important to try to find something valuable in those people's music. And that experience led to being familiar with recording live and outdoors or in non-traditional studios, which came very much in, became very handy when I began to record overseas. And with Tenerawan, it was just the fact that it was a band I loved, and that was something that I pursued quite tenaciously. And at a certain point, it became clear that it wasn't going to happen. But then somehow, through luck or chance, their management changed, and the new management contacted me, and then the whole process started over again. And it was far from an easy one every step of the way, including the recording of it. But the end result was beautiful, and remains so, I think.
What made you want to do that? So like that specifically, like go on that band, go work with them, like that whole project.
Well, I mean, there's many elements. There's two primary elements. One was that my interest and my wife's interest, Marlena Deli, who does all the video and photos for the projects, have been for over a decade to try to provide platforms, bigger platforms, maybe better platforms for people that otherwise don't tend to be heard. Meaning, there's a lot of regions that are kind of just entirely erased in terms of media globally, and those from English speaking and Spanish speaking countries tend to dominate beyond their borders. Every country's got its own media to some degree, virtually, but English and Spanish really dominate. And so we're more interested in hearing from all these other places, which there's more than there are not, that don't have any representation virtually. But beyond that, it's just that Tenerawan is a great band, and it's rare at this point to hear somebody doing something that's highly original. It's hard to do. It's not that those were the good old days. It's just that the nature of recording is that you're amassing over time a bigger and bigger and bigger library of sound, and therefore, the ability to be original 50 years ago was much greater. There was much less competition and precedent than there is now, which virtually everything's documented. And now with with portable technologies, with the internet, with iPhones that can record sound better than a lot of professional recording equipment could even 30 or 40 years ago, and with iPhones that can take pictures better than a lot of cameras could even 5 or 10 years ago, we're seeing an over documentation of often things that maybe aren't so much worthy of needing that preservation. And that makes it, unfortunately, harder and harder for the good stuff to be seen and heard.
So how do you decide what's worthy? Because you were talking about recording these people in San Francisco, and like you not being into their music, and like you recording them anyway because they needed to be documented. And now, and then you're going to Africa. You're going and you're documenting this music that needs to be documented. So, like in your opinion, how do you decide what should survive and what should, like, what is original? Like, what's original good to you?
Well, I mean, first, when I talk about the people in San Francisco, it's not that I wasn't into all of them. Some of them I was, and some of them I wasn't. But I felt that it was a duty on the one hand, and an exercise on the other hand, to record people in a more objective way, which meant, if they could bring 50 or 100 people into a club, that right there is a remarkable achievement. And it was an achievement I oftentimes wasn't able to meet in all my years of playing and touring and gigging. And so I felt like, listening more closely and trying to appreciate whatever it might be that other people heard in them was something worthwhile. And for me, there's two things, and and they're somewhat interrelated, that I listen for, regardless of the genre or where somebody's from on the planet, and that is what they're doing original. Is it something I haven't heard before? It's not so much do I like it or not. It's just, does that sound different? Um, and that isn't something bad can sound different. Something that's really sort of irritating can sound different. So that can't be the only thing. But what I mean is something striking in a somewhat positive way that I've never heard before. And then almost as importantly is, do I believe them? And oftentimes the most believable performers are not necessarily the best performers. They're people that maybe are less self-conscious. They might be more intuitive, and that's going to be highly non-commercial usually. But for me, that tends to be the voices that I want to listen to, and all we can do is make a record that we think is good, and then if one other person thinks the same thing, then for me it's a success. I mean, beyond that, whether it's one person or whether it's a million, it's basically the same exercise.
For sure. So what is I guess how did you get onto this journey of preserving music? What was that process like?
Well, I mean, uh, you know, for better or for worse, it's in some ways it's maybe a curse, but I knew what I wanted to do for almost as long as I can remember, and that was to play music and to be in the arts, and I saw the different narrative forms as being related. I didn't see a big distinction between filmmaking and writing fiction and music. So I aspired to do many of them, but mostly it was always about music from the time I was 5 years old, and so I probably undid myself by being so concerned with never having to do anything else. So I knew I'd have to work for a living the minute I hit age 18, because I came from a working class family, and I didn't have opportunities that beyond that really, and so I wanted to be sure that that was going to be playing music. But of course that is a very difficult thing to do, and it's pretty unrealistic, and so it proved not possible for me to make money playing music at that stage. And I continued to try, and I continued to believe that I had something to offer, and I think I did. But I think that I didn't know how to share that with the world properly, and therefore I was my own worst enemy as an artist. And the only good that can come from that now is that I think it taught me sort of how to help other people not make those same mistakes, so that they can present a stronger, better, purer vision of and version of themselves.
And you've won a Grammy, so it's like you've won a Grammy. You've been nominated multiple times now. So I mean, any way you cut it, you're a successful musician now. Um, how did that how did that realization happen? So when did you realize that you had to start producing, or you had to start helping other people, and you weren't like you were saying, you weren't going to make it as a musician playing music?
Well, I mean, I think all these things are gradual, and they kind of they they cross over one another a bit. But a big one for me was when I saw Vic Chestnut for the first time. He came out to California to do his first California show ever, and my band happened to open for him. And as I watched this person play, I knew that I could never be as good as he was. And he's not someone that most people would like, but he's I believe, one of the great writers in folk music, post Dylan folk music, and even in America, period, in any genre, probably in the late 20th century. And he was extremely prolific. And so, I mean, that was a starting point, is that I knew I was good. Let's say I was better than he was as a guitar player, on a technical level, singer or whatever. But I could never be as good as he was. And as a writer and as an artist. And so that was the beginning. And then I had a friend, Jeff, who was struggling personally in his life and struggling a bit artistically, but similarly, he was incredibly gifted as a writer, and so I volunteered to help him make a record and finish a record. He'd been trying to do it for years, and that was kind of the first time that I really, really went about producing someone other than myself, and I did it purely out of love for this person and love for his art and his music, and again, he was worlds better than I could ever be, and unfortunately, he died, you know, after just one album being made, and sadly, Vic also passed away, but left a massive body of work before he did.
I think there's this joy too that comes with even so you're working with great artists, but even working with somebody who maybe is more unpolished and then getting the song to a place where it actually sounds great. Like when I was I was doing this a couple weeks ago, I was helping my mom with music. I think she went to Berkeley School of Music as well, but it's like she's great at playing, not too great at arranging, and it's just like arranging that song. Like I just felt so good watching it all come together.
Oh, it's beautiful. Yeah, it can make a big difference. Sometimes the little things are not little at all.
So how do you? I mean, are you happy in general, or like what? What's kind of your approach to life?
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I've never felt that happiness was necessarily you know, a goal. I think that that's overrated to some degree. I think appreciativeness, gratitude is something that I constantly feel, particularly when things are bad, because they're not as bad as they could be. So uh, gratitude, yes. I mean, happiness is a complicated thing. I think in reality, one of the big disservices we do to ourselves and to each other in our society is this idea that emotion is pure, and rarely is that the case. More commonly, it's going to be a blend of emotions. So, what do you feel? Yeah, I feel happy, but I might also feel a little bit afraid that I'm feeling happy, or I mean, it's hard to really have a pure emotion. So, but I'm content. I feel like for me a big issue is that, and something that I try to focus on a lot, is that there's 7 billion people or more on the planet, and we pass through, and this idea of fame is absurd. I mean, there's literally a handful of people that might have fame that lasts much beyond their own lifetime, if that, and it's we're fairly insignificant. And but if you can make a contribution, and it contributes to the world in a positive way, then I think that's what being a success is that number one, leave this world without harming anyone else deliberately. Number two, even better, hopefully contribute collectively, net effect, positively to the world. And I think most people do those two things, and that's what kind of keeps us going, hanging on by a thread in some cases, but kind of keeps us collectively moving forward and progressing.
That's interesting. I felt recently, so I'm doing a whole bunch of like stuff, following every passion that I have, and it's like sometimes I feel like I'm doing it just to kind of fill time, I guess I'm wondering, and it sounds like you don't do that, or maybe you do. I don't. Does that resonate with you at all?
No, I know what you're saying. I mean, I think it's easy to do that, and I think it's probably healthy and good to have a lot of interests. And in some ways, these things sort of sort themselves out, and I don't think we should be fatalistic, but I do believe that in hindsight, sometimes you look back and it's like, well, it's really good that I didn't get that job, or it's really good that I had that injury that prevented me from pursuing that activity that otherwise would have consumed me. But I think diversity in all forms is a good thing, and one thing tends to feed another, number one. But number two, I think that when you try to get past your own ego, it's such a hard thing to do, that that a common thing is that most people tend to disown whatever they're best at. So they're spending a lot of time trying to do something that they want to be good at or believe that they're good at, and oftentimes they do that and are very resistant to accepting the thing that they're successful at. I think it's a very common part of existence for a lot of people. So sometimes people look at, a musician who then becomes an engineer, or a aspiring film director who then becomes a grip, and they think that that's, sort of settling or compromise. But, in some cases maybe, but in other cases it's really that their skill set was better suited for this other activity.
And I guess finding that is key. Like I'm thinking of one guy I know that hosts. He runs it's like an open mic business for stand up comedians, and he used to be a musician touring as well. But like you listen to his songs, it's the same thing. It's like it wasn't resonating, and now he does this. And I mean, he's crushing it. He's like an amazing host of stand up comedy. So yeah, I don't know. I think that's really interesting. Um, what if you hate the thing that you're good at?
Well, I mean, I think some people do, and that can be a bit of a dilemma. I mean, the other thing is that, most of us probably are good at more than one thing, and really gifted people, that might have more energy and passion than some. Uh, in some ways, that can be a bit of a handicap, where the person uh, is very easily derailed. And again, it comes back to the ego. They get derailed into sort of the opposite of what we're talking about, which is they find some little channel avenue where they get a lot of praise, and they can have control, and they can have accolades, and it maybe stops them from really going after the bigger thing, because there's more risk in that bigger thing. So again, how do you find that balance? Well, you don't always, but I think that we just continue to be alert and attentive, and another thing that's really overlooked a lot in our society is maintenance. Is that the day-to-day investments that really make a difference. Whether it's to your physical health, or whether it's to the work you're doing. Is probably not going to go according to plan, but the energy that's put out there tends to lead to something, and that's been my path. It's nothing charted out, but I found that generally, if I put energy towards something, it usually comes to fruition. It just usually happens on a different timeline than I wanted. Maybe it's 2 years later, and in a different form, but usually an identifiable form. So, years ago in San Francisco, I had an idea that I would, start a local music paper to support local music. And it was just too big of an endeavor, and I didn't really want to do that. But then about a year later, a local magazine that already existed asked me to start writing about local music for the magazine. So somehow I think, when we put energy out in that way, that it tends to lead to things, but they're usually not as clean and as precise as we would like.
I love that you're just chilling, man. Like you seem so laid back.
Well, I guess, yeah. I'm laid back, I guess, in some ways. It doesn't mean I don't have passion, but it just means that I try to look at the long view, the patience.
How did that develop? Because I think that's really interesting as well. Because most of the stuff you're doing are these huge goals, like preserving music that no one else will hear is like a lifelong goal that really doesn't have an end to it. So where are you getting this long-term view from? Like how did that insight happen?
Well, I mean, I think I don't have a lot of choice. It's just been the nature of my experiences. If the bigger the ask, the bigger what you're trying to do, the greater the risk, and also the more rejection you face. And I think that in most high profile endeavors, what people aren't really prepared for is the rejection and the amount of it, the sheer amount of it, is unusual. Is that most people are shielding themselves from that, and they encounter it. I mean, everybody encounters it, but they certainly are avoidant to rejection. But if you are going to pursue a career in writing or in broadcasting or creative arts, yeah, it's any competitive industry. You're going to get a lot of rejection, daily, multiple times a day, and sometimes those things even reverse themselves, and sometimes it just takes longer than you think, but cumulatively it's not easy, and I think that the dark hidden story of a lot of very famous people is rejection that they sometimes have not resolved. They might have won an Oscar and they might be one of the biggest film stars in the world, but they still aren't quite over the fact that they weren't accepted for maybe a part that they thought was important, and maybe in a movie that went on to be more successful critically than anything they've ever done, and they'll probably be haunted by that to some degree for the rest of their lives, no matter what other success they achieve. So I think tolerating imperfection and rejection is a mark of maturity, and it's something that is really critical to being able to survive without losing your mind, without giving up. And most people you see, they can't do it. They'll come on strong, but 6 months to 2 years in, they're going to be gone. They can't keep it up.
I think a good example of that is how hard you had to chase this band down
Well,
that you won a Grammy with.
yeah, that was a level of tenacity. That was almost 10 years ago. That was a level of tenacity that I'm not sure I would devote to that now. Maybe something else I would, but to pursuing a band, maybe I wouldn't at this stage. I'm not sure. It's hard to know.
Right, but the fact that you did it, I just think it's a good example. Like, you can use that for anything, just having that tenacity. That's really cool. I love that fact. Like, everything, it seemed like, because there's two sides of it. One of my friends is really into intuition. He's like, if there's any resistance from the universe, that means you might be on the wrong track. And it sounds like you take almost the exact opposite path. It's like you just got to push through all this resistance that you're going to face if you're doing anything big, and that's like the only thing you can do.
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I can see truths to either idea, but again, I think it comes back to blends. That neither one's wrong and neither one's right. But in my experience, the almost everything that I've ever succeeded at, including a lot of my most successful relationships, friendships, that sort of thing, are never should have happened. Everything, if I was trusting my gut and doing all the California stuff of listening to the universe, I never would have followed through in these cases, and yet they in most instances have led to something good, but unexpectedly, and again often in different forms, and taking longer than desired, but I'm not so sure that, again, that something feeling right is a very good gauge. Some people maybe have a better gauge than I do, but I think a lot of times that idea is just sort of a lazy way of dealing with reality.
Yeah. Okay. Where do you want people to go after listening to this podcast?
Well, I mean, they can find out more information about stuff we're doing at ianbrennan.com. And I would certainly always, hope that people would be inspired to support great organizations like standingvoice.org, who, work with the albinism community that we did a record with in Tanzania. And, there's many others, but, organizations that are really, working towards helping people, and the majority of the money is going towards that rather than towards administration, I think are incredibly valuable.
Awesome. Thanks for being here.
No, thank you. It was my pleasure.
Thanks for listening to another episode. If you want more content like this, subscribe to the podcast. If you want more in-depth B2B sales training, of course, check out the YouTube channel, b2bsalestraining.org. And if you need marketing support for your digital agency, Experiment 27 helps digital agencies grow their number of leads by building lead generation systems. That is experiment27.com. There's also notes on all the podcast episodes there and free sales courses, which we've gotten some very good feedback about. You can also check out my social media. I'm on Twitter, Alex Berman with no E, ALX Berman, or Instagram, Alex Berman1. Till the next episode, I will see you later.